This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. What does conservatism mean in America? How has political thought evolved throughout this country's history? The American government today bears little resemblance to what the founders laid out more than 2 centuries ago. Should and can anything be done to realign our government with the founders' intent? Those are some of the questions we'll explore in the first half of today's show. Then, on the second half of the show, we're going to switch gears and talk macroeconomics with a Nobel Prize-winning economist. We'll discuss how macroeconomic thinking has evolved in recent decades and what it has to say about events like the Great Depression and the more recent Great Recession. My first guest is Dr. George Will. Dr. Will is perhaps our country's foremost political columnist. His syndicated column appears in more than 400 newspapers and reaches nearly 1/3 of American newspaper readers. He's also the author of 15 books, the most recent of which is The Conservative Sensibility, which we'll discuss on today's show. Mr. Will, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you.
So let's start kind of where your book does with defining what is American conservatism and how is that different from its European counterpart?
European conservatism grew up in reaction really to the French Revolution, and it was about preserving order and status and hierarchy, blood and soil, throne and altar, aristocratic in its desire for stability. American conservatism is quite different. American conservatism wants to say the exhilaration of freedom, the exhilaration of the spontaneous order of a market society is what makes life exciting and creative. That capitalism, which is inextricably linked to freedom and to liberal democracies, capitalism doesn't just make us better off, which it obviously has produced the great enrichment of the last two centuries, but it makes us better by enforcing certain virtues, thrift, industriousness, deferral of gratification, but most of all, the individualism against which progressives in America have been fighting for a century.
That sounds a lot to me like how people today sometimes identify with classical liberalism. Is this very similar to what your version of American conservatism is?
I say in the book that American conservatives are now the custodians of classic liberalism. Locke, Mill, Hayek, Friedman, all the rest. The belief in the fecundity of freedom, the creativity of an open society.
So when you turn to the founding fathers then, other than him also being a Princeton guy like yourself, Madison, I think, is your favorite. Why?
Madison brings together the 3 great strands of conservatism. First, there is, he says, a human nature that is durable, that we are not just creatures that acquire whatever culture we're immersed in. Second, there are natural rights, rights that pre-exist government. First come rights, then come government. And the rights are those that are essential to the flourishing of creatures of our nature. Third, to protect those rights, we need a government strong enough to protect the rights, but not strong enough to threaten those rights, which brings us to the Madisonian constitutional architecture of the separation of powers.
So actually, when we think about this in the Federalists versus Jeffersonians at this time, some people would contrast kind of a classical liberalism or a freedom of the Jeffersonians versus a bigger government in the Federalists. But do you see their projects as both just taking different paths of how to best constrain the government?
I think that's right. When Madison was the driving force behind calling the Constitutional Convention, he wanted a stronger central government because he saw lots of abuses at the local level, majorities in the local level overturning creditors, contracts, and all the rest, debt relief and things that appalled him. Mm-hmm. Madison has been under siege for a century from another Princetonian, Woodrow Wilson.
Right, and this is what you set up in your book as a contrast between the Founding Fathers' vision versus what I wouldn't say starts with, but maybe accelerates under Wilson.
Absolutely. Woodrow Wilson and the progressives generally have been remarkably forthright in rejecting the founders. They didn't mince words. They said, the founders were all right once, but they're anachronisms now. We need a strong central government with more power concentrated in Washington and more Washington power concentrated in the executive branch, particularly in the modern presidency. And they have been remarkably successful. the government we have today bears no resemblance to the balanced government that we had in the vision of James Madison, who wanted, I think, Congress not just to be a co-equal branch, but to be the primary branch of our government. It's Article 1 in the Constitution for a reason. The founders were very wary of executive power, rightly so in my judgment, and under both parties now, executive power has produced an unhinged, unmoored, untethered, and frankly unconstitutional presidency in my judgment.
Yeah, so since you're fast forwarding to the kind of debates today, it does seem like a lot of it between the political parties is just about getting their people in power rather than what the structure looks like. Has conservatism lost its way in this regard?
I think conservatism is a persuasion without a party right now, that both parties are dominated by careerists. It's an old saying that some people go into politics to do something, but most of them go into politics to be something. And most of them just want to get reelected, thinking of the next election, not the next generation, which is why we are beggaring the future, why we are impoverishing the coming generations with our profligate spending of their money that we have borrowed in advance.
So how much of this relates, and particularly within the progressive era and kind of the rise of, now you mentioned Hayek earlier and what he called scientism, and what he labeled the kind of fatal conceit of those who presume to be able to plan society. How related is that to the shift in the ideology, do you think?
Completely related. When at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, science was in the air. Marconi, Edison, the Wright brothers, Ford. And they said the great application was coming of science to society. We would be so wise and so able to master the control of society that we should have a government by experts. Government dealing with what Herbert Crowley, the great theorist of progressivism, called the unregenerate American citizen, who is not really ready for self-government. But the experts bringing wisdom from above down to the American people would regulate us into a more regenerate condition.
And yet, in the 20th century, we saw on the economic side of this, the full-blown planned economies and socialism and the failure such that by the early 1990s, you've got Francis Fukuyama writing, it's the end of history, and it would appear that we're going to turn back in the direction more of the founders. But while globally that's happened a little, that doesn't seem to be where we're headed in the United States. What do you see as the prospects for Americans rediscovering the founding principles and pushing government back in that direction?
Well, as Ronald Reagan said, there are no final victories in politics. You have to keep winning the fight for freedom every day, and you can only lose it once, and it can stay lost. The fact is that the manifest and manifold failures of socialism are quickly forgotten. To the point that we in the United States today have a burgeoning socialist movement, people trying to think well of socialism. To most young people, socialism just means being nice to everybody. But those of us old enough to have studied a little bit know that socialism means the government increasingly metastasizing, government taking more and more control of life, and government itself being captured by interests, so that you have a government that is the plaything of strong, articulate, avaricious, well-funded, well-lawyered, manipulative groups that take the government's intervention in society and the allocation of wealth and opportunity and bend it to their advantage.
I suspect among a lot of the young people today, even those who identify with socialism, they're looking back at them growing up during the Great Recession and seeing that crony capitalism that is this. It's not real capitalism or freedom or free markets, but it's exactly what you just described. And they're equating that with free markets and saying we have to go in the other direction. How can we better reach them?
I think we have to tell them that, in fact, part of the millennial mindset is not socialist, it's individualist. And if you defend individualism, you will wind up defending capitalism, because capitalism is what freedom looks like in everyday life.
So Other than the millennials, and you've just written this book, obviously trying to influence things in this direction, what prospects do you see for us getting back in that direction?
Well, we need leaders, and we need articulate people. Most of all, we need to have capitalism taught and argued for on campuses. This is where the future is we have to tell people, if what you like is prosperity, if what you like is an open future, if you have a lively, wholesome, reasonable suspicion of state power, capitalism is for you.
I think that's great. So we've got just about a minute left, and I'm going to throw you a curveball here, if you will, and ask you to relate your two passions. Is there a connection between your thinking in conservative thought, markets, classical liberalism, and your other passion, baseball?
Baseball is the right sport for a free society because it's about a lot of failure in it. Best hitter in baseball, Ty Cobb, had a career average of about 367. That meant he failed more than 60% of the time. Best team in baseball is going to win 60 games. Worst team in lose 60 games. The worst team in baseball is going to win 60 games. You play the whole season to sort out the middle 42 of the 162 games. Small improvements make an enormous difference at the end of a long season. After 162 games, you are your record. The same is true in a free society.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today and discussing these issues with us.
I enjoyed it.
Up next, macroeconomics, the Great Recession, and more. Stick around. We'll be right back.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeVitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation.
Founded in 2013, the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University promotes the teaching and study of free market economics. As part of our programming, we sponsor a public lecture series open to students, faculty, staff, and the general public in the Lubbock community. Often, the speakers in that series are the guests that you see right here on Free to Exchange. More information is available at www.fmi.ttu.edu. Joining me now is Dr. Edward Prescott. Dr. Prescott is a Regents Professor of Economics at the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University and a Senior Monetary Advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He's also the co-recipient of the 2004 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for his path-breaking research on macroeconomic theory. Dr. Prescott, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you.
So let's begin. I'll take this conversation kind of how macroeconomics has moved over the last 40 years or so, and then how it relates to current policy today. So as you were coming up in your education, the state of the macroeconomic world was kind of characterized by the dominance of Keynesian theory that talked about either using fiscal policy of government spending and taxation or monetary policy to manage the macroeconomy. You came on as part of what originally started as a new classical revolution and ultimately new real business cycle theory. What do you think the major innovations in this revolution were in terms of changing our understanding of the macroeconomy?
There's been a revolution. I worked within the Keynesian macroeconometric tradition in my dissertation in the 60s. And then they tried to make that, develop, they said, the micro foundations to it, trying to use economic reasoning to handle the dynamics of the system. Mm-hmm. Robert Lucas found out that it was impossible, and he had to extend dynamic economic theory to be able to deal with aggregate dynamic issues. And most of the issues are aggregate. It isn't just what happens now, it's what happens in the future.
And this is an important insight from some of your own work that was, of course, cited in the Nobel Prize as well, about the time inconsistency problem of making policies. How does this relate to previous notions of managing the macroeconomy, and what was your contribution to tell them?
The previous was managing the economy was like control theory, guiding the rocket ship to the moon, for example. But with these equations, and it was complicated. And I worked in that and contributed to that tradition. It wasn't only later that I learned from Bob Lucas that was inconsistent with dynamic economic theory, and there had to be extensions, and we made them. And so we had the tools we needed. And the finding was that we had models with people. People are important, just not equations.
And that people will form expectations about policies, not just now, but in the future is some of your work. Can you explain about how you view policy rules versus discretion in helping to deal with the situation?
With the old models, the law of motion of the system was empirically determined, like in physics. But once you have people in there, what people do now depend upon what they think will happen in the future. What happens in the future depends upon what they do now. There's a simultaneous, and the law of motion has to be determined by the theory. That changes everything. Control theory is inappropriate. You figure out the best policy, and if you have the technology commitment, but then after a while, it's not the best policy anymore. And everybody will want to change it and say, well, we promised this, but we're not going to do this. We can make us all better off in a simple case where there's one type by changing, like defaulting on the debt that what they really owe to themselves.
Yeah, so as a concrete example of this, and I know we were talking about the Great Depression a little bit just over lunch today, rather than just an aggregate demand collapse, if people anticipate that tax rates are going to be higher in future policy, that impacted people's behavior in the late 1920s, right?
Yeah, about closer to beginning of 1930, businesses anticipated that tax rates would be higher in the future, and it was not profitable to invest. So what they do with all the money they had, they normally reinvest. They distribute it to the owners. They had lots of access to funds, but they didn't use it for investment.
Precisely because they anticipated future policy.
Correctly, by the way.
Correctly.
Yeah.
So the term real business cycle theory that people have used for what you participated in creating points out that business fluctuations are often optimal responses to real shocks in either technology or policy, like future tax policy. The Great Recession is obviously the biggest macroeconomic event in recent past for most people in their thought. How, in light of your views on business cycle, how do you explain the onset of the Great Recession?
There were multiple factors that gave rise to this. One, in August of 2007, the amount of immigrants, the people that said no, cut the immigrants, and the number of foreign-born people coming in, net amount, dropped from about 1 million a year to 0. That's one big factor. There was the end of a mini tech boom. A third major factor was we had crazy policies with regard to housing that led to overbuilding. And you can't reverse them. You build there, you have to wait to the population growth. They were the major factors that gave rise to a predictable recession.
So in your view, then, the recession was the necessary response to mistakes that were being made, rather than something to
some
be
exogenous
avoided?
and some mistakes. In the housing case, the idea was everybody should have a house, and I think a lot of people, and they subprime mortgages and monetizing that subprime mortgage debt partially was bad policy. And some of the countries in Europe got into trouble. Some ignored it and did great.
In response to the recession, I know you were one of the prominent economists who signed a letter opposing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus package. Why is that?
Empirically, whenever there's stimulus, who benefits? The insiders. Who loses? The outsiders. And it depresses the economy. A stimulus means depress. You have to as you spend more, you got to tax more. And taxing more is depressing.
So this is actually kind of akin to your comment about the Great Depression and anticipating more taxes?
The countries that did, most of the world did well during the Great Recession. The East, China and the Asian tigers in Japan all did well. They were not hardly affected at all. Many countries in Europe were hardly affected at all. Scandinavia, Poland, Switzerland, for example, in particular. Mm-hmm. It was just those big countries like France, Germany, UK, and Italy and of course Greece is the worst, who did their stimulus programs that depressed their economies. Poland said, we can't afford to do it. No, they continued to grow in that Great Recession, never had any.
This relates, since you're bringing Europe up in their response to the Great Recession. You've done a lot of work also on European labor markets versus American labor markets, finding that people work less in Europe. How much less, and the better question, why?
A little history. Originally, using the best standard source for how much people worked, it turned out that Europeans worked 30% less than Americans.
The stereotypical French people
on
not
average,
working.
Right. Throughout these countries. And given our ways to estimate the marginal tax rate, this was just what was predicted by theory. But then later on, we found out that tax rates were not as high in Europe as we got a better understanding of the way they finance the retirement system. They're much more, how much you get is related to how much you earned, what your wage is. In the US, Social Security is pretty much a tax and transfer system to finance retirement. That lowered the effective tax rate. So then the theory said that why were they working so much? But why?
So why were they working so much less in Europe?
But then it turned out they got better measurement of how much they were working. And then it turned out that they worked 15% less per person, per adult. And they produce 15% less output per hour. Total output is equal to total income.
And this is roughly...
That's an accounting identity.
And this is roughly the part about working less...
Now the theory works again.
Explained by differences in tax rates for the most part.
Tax rates, yeah. The nature of the retirement system, which ties into the tax system.
So sure, with our last minute or so here then, as you think about on the horizon, both for the United States and I guess Europe too, what are the biggest macroeconomic challenges? And related to that, if you were giving advice to the president or Congress of what type of policy rules might help ensure better future policy, what type of things would you recommend?
I'd tell the Fed to think long-term. Think of policies such as stabilizing prices at a 2% inflation rate, and not think of the day-to-day things. That comes out of timing consistencies. The day-to-day things, bad.
Right.
But long run. Two, I worry a lot about governments making promises they can't honor, and that's not good governance. And governance matters. That's why there's such big differences across countries. Some countries have better governance than others. Texas is particularly good.
Yeah.
Arizona is very good too. My state.
So in particular, what promises related to Social Security and Medicare or other things too?
Actually, I think our retirement is pretty good shape. It's the medical that's totally out. There's a few little minor revisions that can make our Social Security system sound and honor the promises, up the retirement age as they have, as currently is happening, a little bit like the Swedes have done, as people live longer and have longer, enjoyable retirements.
But it's the Medicare.
But the medical is, that something has to be done there, and I don't know exactly what, but there's going to be reforms. because it's unsustainable.
If something is unsustainable, it will not be sustained. Well,
Yes.
I thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights with us today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure being here.
Well, on today's show, we had a couple of heavy hitters with us. And at first, their topics seemed very unrelated. But I did detect one common thread in the two different discussions, and that's the theme of rules versus discretion. We're in a country that was set up with a system of rules that was supposed to constrain the power of the government and the power of factions to use that government for their own benefit. But over time, we've increasingly got rid of these constraints and left it as a government with discretion where factions increasingly use it for its own benefit, particularly starting in the progressive era with Woodrow Wilson's presidency. Not coincidentally, the Federal Reserve was founded at about that same time. And within a few decades, macroeconomic management, discretion in managing our overall economy, came to be the dominant idea in macroeconomics. Our second guest discussed this state of economics in the 1960s when he came of age, but how thought has changed in the subsequent decades so that macroeconomists now, at least in the academy, think about the value of rules versus discretion and that our economy can perform better if we constrain the power of the economic decision makers to limit their tax and spending authority and macroeconomic management through monetary policy. Unfortunately, we don't detect quite that same shift in public opinion about turning back to the system of rules of our founders to constrain our overall government. For that to happen, we're going to need a lot more to change in the thinking of government officials, intellectuals, and the general public. We'll see you next time.